Welcome, everyone, to another fantasy chat. Today is going to be a rather interesting video because I recently put out my thoughts on YA, which caused quite a few responses within the community. Some were fantastic, others accused me of some strange things, but I decided to bring on one of my favorite YA content creators now after watching a few of their videos. Not that I watch a whole lot, but this one is particularly great. It's the book Leo, right? Is your channel's name. Thank you so much for coming on, and I appreciate you being here and being willing to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So just to be clear, I'm Dutch, so if I make English mistakes, I can't edit this, so that's why.
You're already way more impressive than me. I tried to learn Spanish for 6 years, and I can only say me gusta el queso, which is I like the cheese. The reason I decided to have you on is you made about a 30-minute video which covered apparently a lot of drama that's happened in YA recently. I wasn't even aware of the Twitter thing. I'm not really in those circles. Apparently, there's just constant conversation about the evolution and state of YA. So I'd like to touch on that first, maybe get into some of the counterpoints you had for my video. So what do you think, if you had to just kind of give a 5-minute summation, is the current stemming problem that's causing so much debate around what exactly YA is currently?
I think mostly it's the people who have a lot of pushback is the people who think that YA is something that only teenagers should read. So they don't really understand that when a lot of actually adults still read YA, they think, oh, you're reading down, basically. You're reading something that's meant for teenagers and therefore must be simpler, without really realizing that it's just a different types of stories exist within YA that can sometimes maybe be hard to find in adults, and people have all sorts of reasons to still be reading YA even though they are adults, and it can sometimes be a little irritating as people who read YA to often have people think that what you're reading is somehow less than. And I think actually people who read fantasy can kind of relate to this, because people often look down on fantasy just because it's fantasy, even though they don't know a lot about it. And that's kind of the same thing that people experience when they read YA. People just look down on it because it's YA.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I find it to be something I really tried to avoid. I tried to make it clear within my own videos that I wasn't trying to say YA is for kids, because I even hit on the fact that it seems to have grown up with its audience. It's no longer Harry Potter, now it's much more what Leigh Bardugo is putting out. It's a lot more in that vein of this is about coming into adulthood rather than living as a teenager. Which is something that I find to be very interesting, that it has grown up in that way, and yet it still seems to, for lack of a better phrase, carry some baggage from back when it was more marketed towards kids. And I think in publication, there is a lot of confusion about what is appropriate to put on the YA shelf. Is that fair to say from my outside perspective?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't necessarily call it baggage. I would say that YA is targeted at teens and therefore has more teenage themes, and maybe, I guess you could say that sometimes things are maybe a little more lighthearted and it won't really get very dark and things like that, which can also appeal to a lot of adults. But the problem is that now, even when authors try to write slightly more mature books, the easiest thing, I think, as a publisher, if you want to reach the same just broad audience, you're gonna market it as YA, because then you're gonna reel in all those same people. And sometimes I think that can lead to authors, for example in Six of Crows, where the characters are 17 when clearly they're not. In most situations, I think this just means that authors write stories that they know is going to appeal to the YA audience, not necessarily for young adults, but just the type of story that is YA, which I know is very vague. But I also still don't really understand what makes a story YA, but there is something that makes something YA. And from my video, a lot of...
That's something that I think even those diehard YA fans have a hard time describing. Yeah. What exactly is YA? No one's entirely sure. It seems to be this amorphous blob that kind of shifts as time moves on more aggressively than any other genre. But yeah, that's a good point. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there. And I also just realized I didn't let you introduce yourself and what you do. Feel free. I'm sorry. So what exactly do you do here on BookTube? What would you say your focus is as a content creator?
Yeah, so my name is Leonie, and I have a BookTube channel for almost 5 years now. And I mostly just talk about a lot of books. I love fantasy, but I read anything. So I'm kind of like an eclectic reader, and I just try to find like a happy medium between creative, artsy videos and more like review-based discussion videos, and just like have a fun space for people to talk about books with.
I love that. Like, it's just having a space for people to talk about books. That's something that you really have to like work to cultivate, right? Because there's always the people who will come in and be like, I want to talk about politics, and you're like, please leave. So getting into your response video to what I said, you hit on a couple of the points I brought up, and one of the ones that I actually kind of want to push back a bit is you seem to interpret, and I think I may have said it in a way where it is easily taken this way, that I find themes to be limited because YA can't get dark enough, where I don't find it to be necessarily dark enough. I just find the narrative is unwilling to go certain places that would be considered adult, not necessarily a dark, but because they're still caring about the fact that maybe 13-year-olds are reading this, they just aren't willing to go into, fully exploring a character's sexuality, something along those lines, because they still have to worry, hey, a 13-year-old might pick this up. That was more what I was trying to push into. And I think there is also something to the idea of characters can't be crazy morally gray, though I understand a lot of people have corrected me saying more recently that is changing. That is becoming more prominent in YA. So would you say it's more fair to say, yes, are still some topics and themes that YA can't quite get into because it still has to care about the 13-year-old that might pick up the book?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the reason. And I think a lot of people enjoy it for that, because some people don't necessarily expect that when they pick up a book. I think if you pick up a YA book and you're like a seasoned YA reader, you kind of know what to expect. And then I think you're not as quickly disappointed when your expectations are not met. Because that's something that I noticed. I watched your Six of Crows review video, because Six of Crows is it's my favorite YA book.
Sorry.
Okay. And I watched it and I was like, oh yeah, I understand from watching that video that you had certain expectations, of which I thought, yeah, I don't think Leigh Bardugo ever even set out to achieve that or try to go there. And I think if you pick up a YA book as a YA reader, you kind of know what you're gonna get. Because I think, to me, that's mostly the difference between YA and adult, is that you just need to have different expectations, not necessarily lower expectations, but you just know authors set out to meet different goals.
Yeah,
I know it sounds very vague, but
no, I completely understand what you're saying, especially, I think it is a very different set of expectations, not only from author, but as a reader. And so I find that to be probably like the crux of why so many people seem to be disappointed with YA, because I don't think they completely understand the authorial intent, and it doesn't match with their readers' drive. It doesn't, fit. If you're looking out to try to find the next Malazan, you're not necessarily going to find that in YA, because there's not many YA authors are going to try and go in that direction. But I never want to talk down in any way, shape, or form to YA authors or readers, because I do find some YA books to really hit things that you don't find even in adult fantasy. Especially, no genre is going to talk about adolescence better and the things you're going to go through as a teenager than YA. And it's interesting to see. I don't know. It's the conversations around YA get so heated so fast, and like that's why I tried to really take a lot of effort to be like, here I'm trying to, like, I put on a sports coat. I was like, let's just try and seem as professional as possible, like not getting heated, trying to not talk down. And even still, some people kind of got upset, and I don't know. To me, I just hope that more conversations can have, where people try to figure out what exactly is causing the difference, because there is clearly a divide, right? Like, I'm not going to ignore that. I just find it very not as needed to get as heated as a lot of people do, because I think some people assume there's snobbery going on when there's not, and a lot of people do get snobbish when they don't need to. So I think that's kind of what it boils down to there. And I would love to be able to sit down with, like, Leigh Bardugo is way out of my reach as a creator, but I'd love to sit down with her and have like a conversation of, when you went into Ninth House versus Six of Crows, how did your initial goals change? You see what I mean? Like, I would love to explore that idea.
Yeah, I did read an interview with her where she said that she had this idea in mind for the story, and she just knew that it would never be able to be YA, so she just made the change to adult, which I understand with Ninth House, because it's
Yeah, I mean, that book gives like Tarantino a run for his money, right? Like it's
Yeah.
graphic, and I loved it. I mean, Ninth House, I adore it. I think every single time I've brought it up, I've also mentioned the fact that one of my favorite authors, Stephen King, endorsed it with a fantastic quote of just like, "This is amazing," and I completely agree. I always mention that because it lends credibility to my love of it, and I'm like, here, it's really great. But so, as a YA reader, when you've transitioned into adult fantasy, because I've seen on your channel you've talked about adult fantasy as well, is there like a big difference in what you expect going in, or is there like a different mood you have when you pick up a fantasy book aimed at adults? What is the difference there for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've been trying to think about that myself as well. And looking over there, because my bookshelves are over there, I think I almost don't notice it because a lot of the adult fantasy books that I read are the type of adult fantasy books that people often bring up as like, oh, these are adult fantasy books that would also be enjoyed if you like YA. So to me, all the adult fantasy books that I've read that I liked have that elusive YA vibe, whatever that may mean. I think it's mostly just what springs out to me the most immediately is that the main characters are older, which
Yeah,
yeah,
fair enough.
and they have a little bit more R-rated content. That's what I notice most, and I think I'm gonna be a little less forgiving if the main characters just are a little bit more stereotypical because in YA I kind of expect like, oh, I just want these more like quirky main characters that I can just immediately get behind and just really love. And with adult fantasy, I kind of know that that's probably not what you're gonna get, and I'm fine with both.
One other thing I wanted to cover here that you touched on in your video that should probably be pretty quick. So I talked about romances in YA. And in your response video, you were saying, no, we love romance in YA. I want to
Yeah.
point out, I love romance too. Like, I'm a big old crush my heart with a tragic romance. I'm all about it. I dig it guy. For me, it's in YA, there's so much instant love, and there's so much the romance is based on attraction rather than developing chemistry. That
Yeah.
drives me insane.
Hmm.
I get that if you're writing teenagers, yeah, a lot of it's going to be hormones, but especially like young adult protagonists. You're 17, 18. It's no longer just hormones, right? There needs to be chemistry. There needs to be a buildup. Like Scythe was an example I just read recently, where like it was just suddenly it's like, oh, and by the way, totally love you. Like, and like that's kind of like where my issue comes in there.
Hmm.
And I would love examples of YA books that don't do that, that have
Yeah.
great built up chemistry and dynamics that lead to a romance that feels more real.
Yeah. I think I often hear people say this, like, oh, YA, that's, the books with all the love triangles and the insta-love. Whereas if I look at just how YA has changed over the years, first of all, everyone hates love triangles and insta-love. Like, even YA readers, it's like the most often criticism that you'll hear. But I think over the years, it's definitely changed where love triangles are not there very much, not very often anymore. And insta-love, I do still see it sometimes, but I don't see it as often anymore. I think it also kind of depends on your definition of insta-love, because I do think people saying, oh, I love you still happens way too fast. But I think that's maybe because YA stories tend to never span a long period of time. So then you have to like fit the romance in there because you have to finish the arc, but also it takes place over 1 month. So I think maybe that could be the cause. But personally, I thought the romance in Six of Crows was a really good example of something that has like a slow build up, especially because, they had history. And I can't really think of any examples, but to me, a lot of just recent YA is not going to have a lot of insta-love. I haven't read Scythe, so I don't really know about that.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. It's really I love hearing when people keep saying like recent YA is solving these problems, because I hope that means within 5 years that stuff will have changed the perceptions so that all this stuff can just go away, right? Like as soon as the perception, it'll take a while, but as soon as the perception changes and these problems have been fixed, not that they're inherently problems. If you love insta-love, that's great. Go love insta-love. But I'm just happy to hear that some of these things that are giving people who are just snobbish towards YA ammo might be taken away from them, which is great. To address a mostly adult fantasy audience who may not have been exposed to as much YA, is there any particular books you'd really like to recommend people check out that maybe are that more recent vibe you're talking about, where a lot of these issues aren't aren't as prevalent, can really change people's conceptions around YA?
Well, I did think about this for a long time, and I kind of came to the conclusion that I don't think there's a lot of merit within this discussion to bring out a book and be like, look, this is a book that is unlike all the other YA books that you would maybe enjoy if you don't like YA. Because, you know, my goal here with this whole discussion is I don't necessarily want everyone to suddenly start loving YA. That's
right.
fine if you don't like it. I just want people to understand it and kind of see how it's trying to do different things so that you don't look at it with like an adult fantasy eye and then decide that it's bad, which some people do. So instead of bringing a book that's like, look, everyone's probably going to love it, I do have another book that I think if people were to read this, you would understand YA immediately.
Yeah.
So I have a book that to me is the most YA thing I've ever read, just the most YA fantasy peak thing that I love. And I think I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to you because I don't think you would enjoy it, which is fine. And that is The Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, which was very popular 2 years ago. It had like a movie deal, which I don't think
everywhere.
Yeah. So to me, this book kind of encompasses everything that makes YA great to me. So this book is a fantasy story that takes place in a country that is based on Nigeria. And the fantasy language that is used in this book is Yoruba, which is one of the languages they speak in Nigeria, which already immediately is something that I think YA does really well. That's, from what I know, adult fantasy can learn from, is that YA fantasy has fantasy worlds that are based on like all sorts of different cultures in different things. And they've really stepped away from like the medieval European setting. So to me, this book really does that well. It's also basically an entire allegory for racism. She touches on a lot of those topics, which is really well done. And it just has all the tropes that YA books have. Like the main character has magic. People who have magic are like, they're like oppressed, and they go on this grand journey to bring magic back to the world. It's very clearly inspired by Avatar: The Last Airbender. You can really just pull direct like links between things. And this, to me, is just a perfect example. It's just something that's extremely fun. I've had so much fun with this book. It's action-packed. It's just going all the way through the book, even though it's not that long. Oh, it is. Oh, it's 500 pages. I forgot about that.
Hey, a good sign is that you forgot how long a book is because you burned through it so quick.
Mm-hmm. The only thing that this book does have is insta-love. So that makes it bad. But I would say people want to read a YA book because they just want to understand what YA is, read this book, because I thought this was really amazing. But I do have one other book, just kind of a last resort, kind of like a last chance if you want to try out YA, and that is This Savage Song by V. Schwab.
Because, I've heard of that, yeah.
Yeah, because you've read V. Schwab before, right?
I thought she was fantastic as an author. I just had some issues with the originality of Darker Shades of Magic, but overall I really enjoyed her as a writer. Well,
I think you would also enjoy this because her writing style is still the same. This is kind of a dystopian fantasy. The idea of this book is that every time humans commit a crime, a monster is born, which is a super, super cool concept, right?
Yeah.
We basically follow two characters, one human girl who basically wants to prove herself to her father and prove that she's like tough and ruthless, basically that she's monstrous. And then we also follow a monster boy who just doesn't want to be a monster, he wants to be good. And to me, this is a really good example of how YA is really good at taking, teenage lives and showing us kind of all the internal conflict that they have and how they grapple with this idea of who they want to be and what it means to be good and what it means to be bad. And there's no romance in this one. It's just friendship. This is like my last chance. If you still want to try a YA book, try this one. If you don't like it, then there's no hope for you left.
Well, honestly, the last thing you said there is the biggest selling point for me, because friendships, well-developed friendships, are something I'm screaming for every genre to enhance. I'm so down for a good bromance, galmance, whatever. I just love it when people are just genuinely friends. It makes me so much more invested in the story. And I'm always a little disappointed when there's a great friendship in a book and then they flip it over to a romance and I'm like, damn it, no, you were such good friends. Okay, that's wonderful. If I'm gonna, so I will reciprocate, right? So if there's anything that people who read YA who've always wanted to try more adult fantasy. What could I recommend to them glancing over at my shelf? Something that I think would be a phenomenal bridge, actually, is The Poppy War by Rebecca Kwong. Are you aware of that book at all?
Yeah, it's really a book that's kind of doing the rounds within the YA reading BookTube.
Certainly not YA, but definitely I think a fantastic bridge for YA readers. God, I love that book. I've reread it, I think, 3 times now. It's so good. And I found the follow-up to be as good, if not better. Really ready for the next one. And if I had one more to throw out there, I'll go with what I ended my last video on. I think Red Sister is a brilliant book that I think everyone could read. And it has a lot of the things I think YA readers do enjoy. A younger protagonist, kind of more dealing with adolescence coming into adulthood, but it's just through the lens of a much more unforgiving author, someone who's taking it to places that I think a YA shelf wouldn't necessarily be okay with. And I've also been made aware of there are epic YA fantasy series. I didn't know that was a thing. Is that new?
Well, the one that comes to mind immediately is the books by Sarah J. Maas, the Throne of Glass series.
Okay.
Yeah, that is like the big YA fantasy series that has like 8 books, and that has really diehard fans, and that's really epic fantasy. Personally, I was not a fan, but
Was it the epic elements you weren't a fan of, or just in general?
No, I didn't think it was well written. A lot of people saying that if you like Six of Crows, you should try out The Lies of Locke Lamora, which is a book that one sounds really good. I really want to read that one.
Lies of Locke Lamora is phenomenal, especially if you love friendship at the center of your story. You have to be willing to forgive a few times. You're like, he should have died. But as long as you're willing to forgive that, it'll be great. Also, an epic YA series, I think maybe it's certainly YA. I just don't see a lot of modern YA content creators talking about it, is Wizard of Earthsea. I mean, that is an epic YA series. It's just kind of a bit older. But Le Guin, she's one of the best fantasy authors of all time. And I think that is the best case to be made, that YA isn't constraining. YA can go where it needs to. Like, I've said this, and I think it's the most positive thing I can say about Wizard of Earthsea. You read it, and as you read it, you go, oh, this story couldn't have been told better. Like, this story told 100%. It can't be better than this. So I'd love to see people who are really into modern YA step back and give Wizard of Earthsea a try and see what their criticisms and thoughts are on it, because that would be very interesting in my opinion.
Yeah, there's a read-along going on around some of my friends that are reading all of the Earthsea books right now. Yeah.
Love it. And it's, I mean, you can't argue Wizard of Earthsea is epic. I have the complete collection book, and you could murder someone with that. Like, it is, that's, to me, one of the things about, because YA evolves so fast, I'm always interested to see if people who love the very current stuff, how do they feel about the stuff 10 years ago? Because it's very different, let alone 30 years ago. I'm always curious to see what they think about it looking back. But thank you so much for being willing to come on and have this conversation. I know it's always strange when someone just reaches out to you and is like, hey, are you willing to talk with me as a stranger about this topic that's very controversial? But I appreciate you saying yes to that.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Like and subscribe if you have not already, guys. I will have the Book Leo channel linked right down there. Highly recommend you check it out, especially if you've been interested in some YA content or broader literature as a whole. I'm just a fantasy peasant. She has the whole shebang going on. Go ahead and check it out. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. I'm sure I'm forgetting some of my outro stuff. Have a good one, y'all. Peace. And thank you again for coming on. I appreciate it.